Voice. Alrighty, today we are with Nick Sacco. He is a historian and curator at the Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site, which is part of the National Park Service, in case you don't recognize the uniform he's wearing. So thanks for joining us, Nick.
Thank
So
you.
the question that we are asking everybody that is in this series is 1865 is coming up on the 160th anniversary of events this year. And Illinois, of course, had a big hand in three of what's probably considered the three biggest events of 1865. In February 1st of 1865, Illinois was the first state to ratify the 13th Amendment. Then coming up in April, General Grant, who Illinois does like to claim, even though you're in St. Louis,
I
we do like to claim Grant. Um, he then took the surrender from Robert E. Lee to end the Civil War, and in one of probably one of the most talked about parts of that was he granted a full parole to all the Confederate soldiers to head back home. And then, of course, a few days later was then the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Nice Springfield kid here. Um, so the biggest question is now that we have 160 years to look back and see how things have played out over the last century and a half, what, in your uh, opinion, coming from the Grant home, which one would you kind of look at to be the most important out of the three that has happened in the long run that is really affecting us today?
Sure. Thanks for having me on the podcast. And it's a tough question to start things off with, but I think that is probably in terms of probably the most consequential for American history. I actually would probably make it a really close tie between the Lincoln assassination and the 13th Amendment, the ratification of the 13th Amendment. Not that the Appomattox surrender is not significant, but I have an explanation for that I'll kind of get into a minute. And I think the argument for Lincoln's assassination is that obviously with Lincoln's assassination, we have a very different person in Andrew Johnson who is
Hmm.
replacing Lincoln in the presidency. And ultimately, I would argue that Johnson is the most consequential figure for the Reconstruction era
Hmm.
because of the Lincoln assassination. Obviously, Lincoln was thinking about Reconstruction, and some of his vision for Reconstruction is being implemented, or Lincoln is at least thinking about these things before his assassination. Um, Traditionally, historians have kind of looked to 1863 as a major turning point through a couple different things, with Lincoln issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, changing the war aims
Hmm.
for the Lincoln administration and the Union military in 1863. I also think we can look at Lincoln's 10% plan. Lincoln in 1863, he's trying to figure out a way to make it as easy as possible for a Confederate state to sort of re-enter into the Union and have a functioning state government that is
Hmm.
working with the Lincoln administration. And so even in 1863, Lincoln is saying, hey, if 10% of the citizenry takes a loyalty oath and agrees to abide by emancipation, let's bring that state back into the Union. And of
Right.
course, Congress and particularly the radical Republicans, they're not behind that plan. They believe that it's got to be closer to 50% of
Hmm.
Southerners in a state taking that loyalty oath in order for them to be readmitted to the Union. But I think we can see in 1863 that Lincoln is already trying to think about ways to bring the Southern states back into the Union. And I think through the election of 1864, when he's reelected president, the voters are trusting Lincoln with any sort of post Civil War reconstruction that might take place,
Right.
presuming that, even by late 1864, the war appears to be nearing its end.
Hmm.
So, to a certain extent, I think the eventual ratification of the 13th Amendment and Grant's actions at Appomattox and the surrender are ultimately outgrowths of Lincoln's vision for Reconstruction. And so I think a lot of it revolves back to Lincoln. And had he not been assassinated, it's purely counterfactual and
Hmm.
hypothetical, but our vision for Reconstruction or the way Reconstruction would have played out could have been remarkably different had
Right.
Lincoln still been in office. So I think the assassination is extremely consequential because um, while I would argue that Reconstruction is in many ways our nation's first civil rights movement,
Hmm.
and the combination of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments established citizenship for all Americans and voting rights for men, at
Hmm.
least, regardless of race. Um, we can only hypothetically speculate as to what it would have looked like under Lincoln if Reconstruction would have ended sooner, if there would have been more of an embrace for racial equality and political equality had Lincoln remained president. So I really think a lot of it has to start with that assassination and just how dramatic the change was
Hmm.
from Lincoln to Johnson.
Yeah. You had mentioned the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and you know that obviously the 14th Amendment is something that's coming up in the news here, even nowadays, a lot with the executive orders to try to rescind the birthright citizenship. Um, and that obviously just is a direct descendant almost, comes right out of the 13th Amendment. There's the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment. Um, when the 14th Amendment passed, was it inevitable after the 13th, or was that still a fight?
I think it's a really good question, and I can't really speak too much as to current contemporary debates about the 14th Amendment, but in historical context, a couple of things to keep in mind. So with the 13th Amendment, um, there's sort of a novel legislative move that has taken place with the 13th Amendment because Section 2 of that amendment says that in order to enforce the 13th Amendment and to enforce the end of involuntary servitude in America, Congress was enabled to enact appropriate legislation to
Hmm.
enforce the 13th Amendment. So, Section 2 is sort of a catch-all term that gives Congress really broad powers to enact future legislation to enforce the end of slavery in the United States. And so the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments all have this clause in those amendments authorizing the establishment of further legislation to enforce those amendments. And I think that is really crucial for the future development of Reconstruction. So I think we can see that with the 14th Amendment, 14th Amendment is the longest amendment in our Constitution. It's really wide ranging,
Hmm.
encompassing all sorts of things with birthright citizenship, the idea that anybody born in the United States is automatically a citizen, regardless of their particular background, establishing concepts like due process and equal protection of the laws,
Hmm.
even a clause in there about the public debt and ensuring the maintenance of the public debt. But then the 14th Amendment really being an outgrowth of the 13th Amendment. I would say, though, that it wasn't necessarily inevitable that the 14th Amendment would follow from the 13th. Again, going back to Andrew Johnson, Andrew Johnson is not a willing participant in this process of establishing citizenship in particular, for African Americans.
Hmm.
We have to remember with the 13th Amendment that really it's only guaranteeing freedom. And while that is extremely significant that you have ownership of yourself and you're no longer considered the property of another human, the 13th Amendment doesn't guarantee a right to vote. It doesn't guarantee citizenship. It doesn't guarantee protections of federal laws. There's a lot that's not guaranteed through the 13th Amendment. And so when Republicans in Congress start debating the expansion of citizenship and envisioning a post-war Reconstruction in the South, Andrew Johnson, from the very get-go, is not a willing participant in any of this.
Hmm.
The Civil Rights Act of 1866, which ends up becoming the very first federal civil rights law in American history, Johnson vetoes that act. And it's one of the first times in American history that Congress will override President Johnson's veto. But Johnson has a long veto message where he goes on about the possibility of a race war between whites and blacks, the possibility of Black Americans getting the right to vote and creating unnecessary racial strife. And Johnson kind of takes this sort of federalist states' rights approach. In his mind, the
Mm-hmm.
federal government, citizenship and voting should be left to the states to resolve on their own. But a lot of Republicans, rightly pointed out that, wasn't that sort of the reason we had a civil war in the first
Mm-hmm.
place? Is
Yeah.
that things like citizenship and voting and the place of Black Americans in American society, those things were left to the states, and that kind of contributed to the war breaking out in the first place. And so I would say that, Johnson views himself as following Lincoln's vision for Reconstruction, and that he believes that he is the chief executive, is sort of the arbiter and leader of the Reconstruction process instead of Congress. But at the same time, we know that Lincoln, right before his death, his last public speech, he openly talked about opening voting rights for, in his language, the very intelligent and Black men who served in the military during the Civil War. So
Mm-hmm.
Lincoln was thinking about the expansion of rights for African Americans beyond just the concept of freedom,
Mm-hmm.
beyond just the 13th Amendment. Lincoln was already thinking about other rights that African Americans might be entitled to in a post war Reconstruction. But Johnson really goes back on that vision and is completely opposed to the 14th Amendment. So while it ended up following the 13th Amendment and expanding citizenship rights for African Americans, that was not inevitable, and President Johnson did his best to stop that process completely.
So, of course, the third item that we talked about in the beginning question was Grant's parole of the Confederate Army soldiers. How big of a controversy was that at the time?
Sure, it's a really good question. Um, we tend to forget sometimes that many Republicans in Congress view Lincoln as being far too lenient towards Confederates.
Mm-hmm.
And going back to Lincoln's 10% plan, some of the more radical Republicans are arguing that, in order to guarantee a Republican form of government, which is stated in our Constitution that the United States government would guarantee a Republican form of government in all the states.
Mm-hmm.
They're saying, there's no way that only 10% of people can take that loyalty oath and be a true representative government of the people. And they viewed Lincoln as just being too lenient and too anxious to bring the states back into the Union.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Lincoln, towards the end of his life in 1865, he told this story about his approach to Jefferson Davis, and he told this story about an alcoholic that was he's trying not to drink any further, but he's at a social function, and the bartender offers him a drink, and the man says, "Well, I just want a lemonade. I'm not drinking anymore." And the bartender says, "Well, are you sure you want that?" And the man says, "Well, if you put a little alcohol in, just don't tell me that you did that."
Mm-hmm.
And Lincoln's point in saying this is that, he preferred to just let Jefferson Davis leave the country.
Yeah.
And he didn't want to know about it. Just basically, if the military saw Jefferson Davis, let him go and don't tell President Lincoln about it. Just let him go.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of Republicans are just not on board with that. They're ready to bring the noose out, and they're ready to, put Confederates on trial and to hang them in some cases. And
Mm-hmm.
so when Lincoln talks about malice towards none in his second inaugural address, some Republicans thought, well, we should have malice towards some at the
Mm-hmm.
very least. So Lincoln, his approach is even controversial within his own cabinet. Perhaps most notably, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton has a completely different and more harsh vision for Reconstruction, and he is trying to thwart Lincoln's vision for a quick and easy Reconstruction. So I would argue that with Grant, his approach to Appomattox is highly influenced by what Lincoln wants with a quick, lenient Reconstruction. Lincoln himself uses the term a just and lasting peace.
Mm-hmm.
And Lincoln believes that a just and lasting peace is going to be executed by a fairly lenient process for former Confederates to become American citizens again. So Grant is in a very delicate position because he is not in a position to really speak to political matters, even the military itself is a political institution. But he's
Hmm.
trying to navigate Lincoln's vision for a just and lasting peace while still trying to wrap up things with the Confederate military. So a couple things to keep in mind with the Appomattox surrender is that this surrender only applies to the Army of Northern Virginia.
Hmm.
While Robert E. Lee, early in 1865, about 2 months before the Appomattox surrender, had technically been promoted to the top general for all Confederate forces, Appomattox only applies to the Army of Northern Virginia.
Hmm.
So there are still tens of thousands of Confederate soldiers in other parts of the country that are still fighting and are still considered, a functioning army, even though the Army of Northern Virginia specifically is surrendering to General Grant. And the surrender terms are going to be vigorously debated afterwards as well. Many Confederates believed that the Appomattox terms essentially they essentially guaranteed pardon or amnesty for the Confederates in the Army of Northern Virginia. That's not necessarily the case in
Hmm.
reality. A parole, so the surrender terms are first and foremost, it's a parole. They're
Hmm.
parole terms. So soldiers in the Army of Northern Virginia, rather than being imprisoned by the U.S. military, they're on parole. They're permitted to go back to their homes. The enlisted men are allowed to take their horses back home, to get back on their farms, and get back to the work of and making a living for themselves.
Hmm.
And the Confederate officers are permitted to take their firearms back with them. So it's a parole, but a pardon is somebody being relieved of all legal consequences
Right.
of their actions. Grant is not necessarily saying that these Confederate soldiers are being forgiven of all of their actions, and they're not going to have any legal consequences whatsoever. So Lee, he will say later on after the fact that in his mind, he accepted these surrender terms, believing that the men that are listed under him would have no future legal consequences for their time in the Confederacy. But that's not necessarily the reality of the situation.
Hmm.
Um, these men are still liable to be prevented from office seeking and serving an elected office. They could have their voting rights rescinded. There could be other elements of their citizenship rights that could be rescinded as well. And I would argue too that Grant is ultimately right in saying that this is not a pardon because the U.S. Congress later on had to pass legislation outlining pardon and amnesty for Confederates. Andrew Johnson, a month after the Appomattox surrender, issues an amnesty and pardon in which most Confederate soldiers, but not all, if they took a loyalty oath, and in the case of high officers, if they went to the White House and bent the knee and took a
Hmm.
loyalty oath to President Johnson specifically, they were pardoned after that. That law, that Johnson's pardon and amnesty, that would not have had to be ratified if Appomattox already established a pardon through the surrender terms, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Um, Even Grant, as president, will sign into law in 1872 an amnesty act that applies to almost every former Confederate, even the high military and political leaders that were exempt from the 1865 Act. Again, President Grant doesn't have to sign that amnesty act into law in 1872 if amnesty had already been granted at Appomattox in 1865. So the surrender terms set a precedent for future surrenders.
Hmm.
When Joe Johnston surrenders forces in the Carolinas to William T. Sherman, Edmund Kirby Smith and Stan Waddy surrendering forces under their commands in Texas in the
Hmm.
summer of 1865. The Appomattox surrender terms set the precedent for that. But at the same time, Appomattox doesn't really provide a blueprint for the future process of reconstruction, and it still leaves a lot of murky territory in terms of what rights former Confederates were going to have after the Civil War. So it gets kind of hairy in the weeds
Hmm.
there, legalities of it, but I think that's why I would argue that the Appomattox surrender is extremely significant, but the long-term consequences of it are a little murkier compared to the assassination in the 13th Amendment.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your insights on this question. And it's definitely been a fascinating series to explore.
Thank you. Appreciate you having me on. And I'll just do a real quick plug for Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site as well.
Definitely.
As you mentioned, we are a unit of the National Park Service. We're in St. Louis. There are two units of the Park Service in St. Louis, with the Gateway Arch obviously being kind of the most iconic national park in the state of Missouri. We're about 12 miles south of the Gateway Arch. So we're in the suburbs of South St. Louis County, and we managed Ulysses S. Grant's Whitehaven estate. So
Mm,
Whitehaven was a house where Ulysses' wife, Julia Dent Grant, she grew up at Whitehaven. So the Dent family owned this house before the Civil War. And Grant, he was stationed in St. Louis in the 1840s when he was just starting off as an officer in the Army, stationed in nearby Jefferson Barracks here in St. Louis. And while here, he met Julia. They fell in love, began their relationship at Whitehaven. And after a decade of service in the Army, Grant came back to St. Louis. And in the 1850s, he actually lived here at Whitehaven with Julia, his children, and his in laws, for better or worse.
hmm.
And it was a plantation. There were enslaved laborers here on this property as well. So we really interpret Grant's life before the Civil War and his experiences here in St. Louis at the Whitehaven estate. And we give tours of this house every day. So we're open 9 to 5, 7 days a week, giving tours of the Whitehaven estate. So I encourage your listeners, especially if you're in Illinois, it's not too far of a
Exactly.
drive to come down to St. Louis to come check us out here
Yeah.
at
And it's definitely it's a great place to spend a day, just walking the grounds, checking out the house, checking out the outhouses and stuff. But the grounds itself are just so beautiful that you
Thank
can
you.
really spend the most of the day just exploring the grounds and just taking in the natural wonder of Whitehaven as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. Really appreciate it. I know you've been here too,
Yeah.
so you can speak from personal experience. So really appreciate the opportunity, and we'll see you here in St. Louis in the future. Thanks so much.
Thanks.